Good evening, everyone. If you can believe it, we are already in week 5. Just a couple of housekeeping things I want to clean up first. I am working on getting your nonprofit profile assignment grades back to you. I anticipate having those all out to you with comments no later than Tuesday. If there is a delay on my end, I'll be sure to give you an update on the announcements page, but I certainly don't expect any type of delay. I've already gotten through about a third of the papers, and I have to tell you, so far they've really been well done. Hopefully that trend continues for the rest of the papers, but I just want you all to know that on the whole, I've been very impressed with the types of nonprofit organizations that you're covering, the reference to reading materials, and the clarity of the writing. So I'm very pleased so far and look forward to reading the rest of the assignments. All right, with that out of the way, we are on the second lecture of Unit 3 this week, and we are continuing our theme of nonprofit organizational structure. So as always, beginning with a review of last week, I mentioned early in that lecture from last week that we would be looking at 4 components: structural forms, board of directors, executive directors, and governance, which again really explores the relationships between these different elements. So last week we really focused on structural forms. This week in the lecture we'll be addressing these other 3 components. So on that discussion of structural forms, we focused on the 7 types that were presented in Shara Hart and Beulah Field chapter 4. And these structures ranged from the ideal type of mechanistic, which is very formal, hierarchically organized, all the way down to organic, which was the least formal of the arrangements. And I had previously distinguished these 2 as being kind of militaristic versus egalitarian in that ideal type setting. But apart from the ideal types, we also looked at 5 other types that existed on a range of formality in between those ideal spectrums. And those covered everything from divisional to functional to virtual network to matrix. And again, if you need a refresher on that, the slides from that lecture are still available that present the visual cues that hopefully helped break down some of those more complex ideas. But I also want to touch on the question that I brought up in the lecture last week and that I've seen really resonate throughout the threaded discussions. And that question is, why does structure matter? And when I was having kind of a debate about this with one of the students, hi Katie, the question came up is, I still kind of think of this as, the student said, I still kind of think of this as very technical academic information. How is it important in practice? And after thinking on that question some more, the best answer that I could come up with was really that structure, if nothing else, enhances accountability. And that is to say, if your organization has a structure on paper and you find that in practice you deviate from that structure and there are perhaps breakdowns or inefficiencies in communication, or there is a lack of clarity regarding roles and responsibilities, you can look back to that structure on paper and see where those gaps are existing and try to find a way to remedy those. So while structure does often exist in the background when we're having conversations about effectiveness, it can be there as a tool to mitigate conflict and be able to have discussions in the form of, we have this type of structure that says our roles and responsibilities are delegated in this particular way. And because we're seeing some challenges in communication across our departments or across individuals, or positions might be a better word for that, we can look at the structure and figure out where we're deviating so that you can hit the proverbial nail on the head with what's wrong, but you can also depersonalize potential issues in such a way that the individuals within that organization are hopefully more willing to engage in a discussion about it without taking it as a personal attack. So at the end of the day, that's really where I break down the question of how structure matters. There's a vast academic literature that's also devoted to structure. And if someone would like to hear more about that, I can certainly get into that in the threaded discussions with you all, but it does tend to veer on that very technical side of the spectrum. So for now, we'll say structure and accountability, and move forward into the main theme for this week, which again means that we'll be talking about boards of directors, executive directors, and governance. So what I want to do is start in this week's edition of How Technical Was the Chapter Reading I wanted to present the visual cues that discuss nonprofit board governance in a way that's similar to how I had presented the organizational structural forms in the week prior in that lecture. And that's really because of some of the feedback that I saw from you all that mentioned that these visual accompaniments were actually a little bit helpful to kind of distill some of the more complex underlying themes. And I also want to clarify that these structures are going to focus on the 5 that were presented earlier in the chapter. There were the additional forms like satellite governance, for instance, that were presented later, but those are really grounded more in member-serving organizations, and they're more applicable to, I think, a limited number of nonprofits like professional associations. So I want to focus on the 5 kind of bigger picture governance models. The first of which is the policy governance configuration. This comes out of the research from Carver, and as the book states, it's really used in things like universities and hospitals, but we also find it's a pretty common model more broadly in nonprofits. And I think that has to do in large part with the fact that it really is formalized. There is a clear delineation of roles, and the structure of authority is hierarchical. So at the top of that list, you have the board of directors. Below them, you'll have an executive director or 2 who reports to and is accountable to the board. And then under the executive director, you have staff. And so the board in this way, sitting at the top of that arrangement, is really responsible for those big picture considerations. Now, all of the board governance models that we're going to talk about today have to adhere to those 3 duties of care, loyalty, and obedience. And I thought the book did a nice job of providing a complement to the readings from Hopkins and Gross that we had last week when we talked about the main roles that boards have. So fiduciary duties tend to be the most important, also developing bylaws, setting the general kind of organizational culture. But more often than not, in order to achieve their purposes, board members must be responsible for those 3 items. And as a brief refresher, care means effectively being in the know about your organization. What's the financial status? Who are the staff? The ins and outs of the management. The duty of loyalty says that a nonprofit board member will not put the nonprofit's mission or program second to their own interest. And so there are some legal restrictions on the extent to which board members can employ their own personal organizations in relation to board activities in a contracting environment, for instance. But it really is that board members agree to put the nonprofit mission first before their own interests. And the duty of obedience gets back to more of that legal ramification, that they must be aware of the law and then also ensure that the nonprofit organization is following the legal mandates, which are both federal and state operated. So all of the models have to adhere to those principles, but the actual differences in structure are apparent across the models. So not to reiterate too much, but since I diverged a little bit, the policy governance configuration, the most important thing to get out of this is that it is formalized, that boards are pretty much permanent members, the mandates are very formal, and there's a clear delineation of authority. The next version down from the policy governance model is this constituency or representative configuration. Now, the book makes the point that this model in particular is also very formalized. The big difference between the constituency form and the policy governance form is that the policy governance has that clear hierarchy. So there is some devolution of authority, but it really follows this linear pattern. The constituency-based configuration is much more decentralized. The board will delegate into committees on which sometimes board members themselves will serve. And at the end of the day, they're looking for ideas that will best satisfy their constituents. And constituents in this sense can be equated with the term stakeholders. So not only are board members making sure that they're satisfying the needs of other members who are on the board, but they're also seeking engagement from the executive director, from staff, from donors, and really making sure that the balance of interests is achieved. And oftentimes we'll see this form in larger nonprofits where delegation is used. The book used the example of, I think it was the NAACP, where the boards were structured kind of regionally to answer those questions. So those local regional chapter boards would be kind of equivalent with the committee configuration aspect of this. And the graphic is a little hard to read, so I won't get into it now, but of course these slides will be accessible. But what this board does, this particular visual does, is put the board in the middle here where I'm pointing, and then kind of talk about the three different components that the board would be responsible for. So everything from culture to capacity building to policy. So in this configuration, it's not necessarily just on that big picture formation that the policy governance model has, but in fact, it's getting more integrated into the facets of organizational culture and more on the ground decisions. If we further devolve the chain, what we're going to see next is the entrepreneurial or corporate configuration. And what we have here is really a stress on innovation. This is a board that's going to function more like its private sector counterparts and really look for new ways to bring innovation and flexibility to the table. And what I want to point out in all three of these configurations, if you see here this link that again you'll be able to access directly from the slides, they all come from a website that I think is actually quite useful. It's practitioner friendly. The three images, the two that preceded it and this one, are the three most common types of board configurations, and they've gotten a lot of treatment. And so what this website does, it not only explains the visuals in more detail, but they also provide some really practical tips for how to best manage communication within those settings when your board has different configurations. So if you're interested in learning more about the board configurations and how as a staff member or an executive director you can really interact with boards given the types of roles that they're fulfilling, that website has that information for you. Finally, down the line, the least formalized of the board models is this emergent cellular configuration. I couldn't find a visual for it, but I think the 4 points that are stated here really summarize this in a very concise manner. So the first, in the book reinforces this point as well, the emergent cellular model is really going to have an emphasis on an organic and flexible structure, and again bringing back this idea, this idea of innovation. A board in this way is going to be much more collaborative, and they'll act almost more as conveners or facilitators. They want input in various ways, but I think to some degree equally from staff members, from the executive director, from those stakeholders. Not dissimilar to the constituency model, but it is done in that more egalitarian way of saying we're all in this together, and even though legally we might have a standing where you have to report to us, we're not going to enforce that in practice. And so this type of configuration could be particularly useful for smaller nonprofit organizations where that structure is more organic anyway, and so this type of communication pattern fits really well with that structure. Or also the book had mentioned some of the more advocacy-driven nonprofits where you want that emphasis on being innovative, on being flexible, and as this point makes, on challenging assumptions so that the nonprofit can fulfill its mission in the most efficient and efficacious manner possible. The final governance model that was presented was the hybrid configuration. Again, we're not really going to see a visual accompaniment to this, but the key takeaway for this particular form is really that it's just a mixture of governance models. So just like the mechanistic and organic structural forms, where ideal types, you might see in practice situations where you don't clearly have a policy governance board or just a constituency, or there might actually be a blend that just happens either strategically or more organically across those. And so the example that I provide here in this slide is really that you might have some long-seated board members, that's in the tradition of the policy governance model, but they devolve that authority to subcommittees in order to make decisions, and that's more representative of that constituency model. So when we say hybrid, we just mean a mixing of forms. All right, so moving into the next theme, I know we're covering a lot this week. The next part of these chapters focused on executive directors and styles of leadership. So what I wanted to do in this part of the lecture was focus on some big picture questions. The first of which is, what roles do executive directors play in nonprofits? It might sound like a straightforward question, but I think that the book does a nice job of outlining some of the complexities that are involved. Because legally, the board is actually the most superior position in a nonprofit organization, and the executive director is accountable to that board. And yet we might not always see that type of arrangement in practice. And the reason for this is because boards meet infrequently. Sometimes it's quarterly, sometimes it's once a year, sometimes it could be a little more. It really depends on the organization. But the idea is that they are there to review those big picture things. What do our financials look like? What does our organizational structure look like? Are we in compliance with the law? Is our mission still relevant? And so the boards don't always have an opportunity to see what's going on at the ground level. And that's what the executive director is responsible for. They function very much like a CEO in a corporate environment or a manager or department director in the public sector. So they are the ones who are making the strategic decisions on the ground. Now, because there's a disconnect between the 10,000-foot view that the board has to have and the on-the-ground, in-the-weeds management view that the executive director has, this can open the room, open the possibility for some conflict about who is responsible for what, who is accountable for what decisions, and if there is a conflict in the decision-making perspective, who gets the final say on that. And so that's what that second question, it kind of segues into that, is what is the relationship between an executive director and the board of directors? And ultimately, ideally, it should be that balance of an executive director reporting to boards to give updates, but to some extent being left to operate autonomously in pursuit of the daily managerial operations. And in order to accomplish that, we see different styles of leadership. And I think where the book this week kind of steered away from that very technical discussion, and where they did a particularly good job, was to outline in practice types of conflict that we might see, different types of leadership styles that might be employed, and ways to mitigate conflict in a meaningful way. I don't want to get too much into the leadership styles in particular, although I do see it coming up in some of the discussion posts, and I'm actually really glad to see that happen. But in the next unit, which will begin on Monday, we're going to get into the leadership styles. And in particular, we're going to start with an introduction to human resource management and motivation, and then segue in week 2 into a much more detailed discussion from the Nordhaus chapters that are available on Canvas that talk about the skills approach and transformational leadership. So we can really dive into those themes a bit more, but I certainly wanted to acknowledge that it was covered this week. Again, at the bottom, we see a link here that I'm circling. This is from the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits. And not only do they have a great article about the relationships between executive directors and boards of directors and some of the conflicts that might emerge, but their website as a whole is also really practitioner friendly about different facets, all the way from starting a nonprofit to daily management. So I brought you to this link in particular because the question for this week asked about the relationship between executive directors and boards. But certainly I think the website itself is actually of some value and might be useful to you in your final paper. All right. The last of the reading assignments that we had for this week came from the McCluskey article, Rethinking Governance. And I liked this article for several reasons. The first is that McCluskey reinforced some of the themes that we found in Sherhart and Bielefeld, particularly with Carver's policy governance model. I also liked that even though it was an article that was written for an academic audience, it was not inherently overly technical. I thought it was written in a way that was accessible, it was practically oriented. And I also liked that he presented kind of a counter perspective that challenged some of the ideas that were brought up in the Sherhart reading. And so in particular, what McCluskey does, some of the main takeaways that I have on this slide are starting with Hoole's shared responsibility model, moving into Carver's policy governance model, and then ultimately presenting a framework that challenges these two, acknowledging that they have become really kind of commonplace, widely accepted, and he does acknowledge the benefits of these models. But his main point, if you take away nothing else from the chapter, is really that board structure should be context dependent. And the way that he conceptualizes this is first moving from different levels of analysis. So you've got the institutional level, that's that 10,000 foot view. What does the system look like? Into the managerial level, which is more of the executive director role, making those daily strategic decisions, down to the operational level of governance, which is where the work is getting done by staff and volunteers on the ground. And it's within those different levels of operation that we can understand the role of the board of directors. And so that division of responsibility within those settings is really contingent on 7 factors. That's the argument that he's making, and it's ultimately those 7 factors in total that will determine the appropriate configuration, so that we're not just leaning on something like the shared responsibility model or the policy governance model if it turns out that it's not a good fit. And so the 7 factors that McCluskey discusses are the size of the organization itself, which includes its budget, number of staff, volunteers, which I thought was an interesting point because it was not just the number of volunteers that matter, but also the degree to which their roles are a central part of the organization's mission. So is the organization itself really volunteer-centric, or are volunteers more of a program-driven component of the organization? The next is in what stage of the life cycle is the organization, and that's because a nascent nonprofit organization might benefit from a board that is more formalized to help steer that ship as the nonprofit is getting its sea legs together, versus a nonprofit that might have been around for a while that is in transition. The next component was trust, and primarily focusing on the trust between the board and the executive director. And what was interesting here, and I apologize that I'm laughing, but it was just that he was really honest in this discussion, was that effectively if a board does not have confidence in its executive director, or thinks that the executive director is incompetent, they're going to be more inclined to oversee some daily operations and really be involved in the day-to-day programs and practices of the organization. This again might cause conflict, but that concept of trust I thought was a really interesting one to bring out. The second, this kind of gets into this idea of life cycle as well as this idea of transition. So particularly with managerial roles or board roles, how does that transition of positions affect the type of role or the scope of the role that the board will play? The next is crisis, and what he means by crisis is really more external. It's this environmentally driven. So the board will likely be more involved in times of economic strain, for instance, than it will if everything is running smoothly. And finally, an extenuation of that again is the environment. So always being aware of the contextual elements that surround the organization. But ultimately, McCluskey's argument is that we really need to look at these 7 components in totality before determining that one size fits all for board governance. So hopefully you found the article to be accessible and a nice complement to the other readings. So now I'm going to move into the questions or food for thought. I want to revisit a little bit in a slightly different way the question that I posed earlier about the relationship between executive directors and boards, and ask how do nonprofits effectively balance the roles of boards and executive directors to enhance effectiveness. And something we see in this link here, this is a professor named Joan Geary. Her description on the website says that she's like the Dear Abby of nonprofits, but she has this actually this really interesting article that I wanted to link to you all, which says how do you write a board report. So because boards are more inclined to meet less frequently, and you have limited opportunity as a staff member or as an executive director to get their engagement or to get their perspective on issues, how do you distill the most important themes that need to be covered in a board meeting? And so she gives some really practical tips on everything from the length of a board report to the type of language that you're using, the scope of the problems that you're addressing. And she does this from her own experience, and she does it with a bit of humor as well. So again, there's just a complement to the readings that you can link to if you wish. But start thinking about that question of how do we effectively balance the relationship between those two things, and
and how can we mitigate conflict so that it does not escalate and make those relationships ineffective, which will ultimately be detrimental to the organization as a whole. The second question, kind of an extension of that, asks, how do executive directors, staff members, or other key stakeholders effectively engage board members? And the reason I brought this question up was because I noticed throughout the discussions that this tended to be a common concern. People were saying, we don't even know what our board does. They're not present in the way that a manager within the nonprofit world might be. And if we do get them to the table for these meetings, they're not always eager to listen or to be involved. So are they just kind of those rubber stamp boards that McCluskey had mentioned? And so just a couple of subsets to this question that we can start thinking about is training. And training is something that on a practical level, I struggle with. I say that honestly because I am someone who is driven by the concept of efficiency, and I find that there are times when we're engaging in too many meetings, or what I perceive is too much emphasis on training, that we're taking away time from the actual work that needs to get accomplished. That being said, when I'm learning in the practitioner world is that trainings, even though they can be a time suck on the front end, can ultimately be efficient in the long run for your organization, because you've established a set of standards and common practices that should be adhered to. And if those expectations are laid out really clearly, it should make other tasks run more smoothly without having to waste more time getting people up to speed. So that might be one way. They talk about trainings for board members in the book. And I think it was actually Herman and Renz who made that point, that board members who have training are more effective than those who just kind of get roped into the board without maybe understanding its purpose or how to fulfill some of those objectives effectively. The second piece of this is clear communication of expectations. This reinforces, again, some of the more practical themes that we saw in the chapters this week on how to mitigate conflict, but it's something that sounds really intuitive, right? Of course we need to communicate clearly, and yet do you ever find yourself in a situation where an expectation is just assumed to be there, and before you know it, there's been a disconnect or an inefficiency because that expectation was never communicated. And so part of the way I think that we can get board members engaged is to come up with really informative guidelines about, this is how we see the role of the board of directors. These are the skill sets that we value that you bring to the table. Again, that gets back to that concept of thanks that was mentioned in the book. So a little bit of that ego stroking. Thank you so much for your participation. We value your commitment to the board. The best way that we think that you could be effective in the setting or the board as a whole would be to accomplish A, B, and C, and then also leave it open for board members to ask to clarify their expectations about staff. So that might be another way to kind of get at this. And finally is getting back to the idea of leadership styles and having an awareness of leadership styles, because if nothing else, leadership styles are reflective of personality. Hopefully they're also reflective of professional competence and training, but we might find that individuals are more inclined to exhibit the tendencies of one leadership style over another. And so if we can be aware of those styles that we prefer individually and also get a sense of what those board members prefer, then hopefully we can enhance that communication channel and really help get those board members engaged based on the styles of leadership that they have and the roles that they expect the board to take on. So again, just some food for thought. Think it through. I know we're running long this week, so I'm trying to get through it. But I know I'm going fast. So if there's anything that you want me to go back and cover, then please let me know in the discussion. We'll keep these things going. But for now, I want to focus on the application. And what I want to do in this application is to link the structural configuration that we covered in Chapter 4 to the board governance model. The reason that I want to focus on this is because it's part of the threaded discussion for this week, and I know there were some concerns about the technical level of information that was covered in Chapter 4. So I thought by throwing out a couple of questions, it might help shore up some of those points of confusion. And so what I'm asking here basically are different ways that we could overlap the structure and the board governance model. So the first would be mechanistic and policy governance. Do we think this is a good fit? Well, what are the characteristics of the mechanistic organization? It's formalized, it's hierarchical, it's centralized decision making. What's a policy governance model? Well, it functions much the same way. Because there is that overlap, do we think that this is an appropriate fit? Should these things work complementarily to one another, or is there a benefit to having a board model that's maybe a little more organic? I don't have the right answer to that question, but if we start thinking it through in that way. Similarly, what about organic and either this entrepreneurial or emergent cellular model? Well, if you have an organic structure that really is based on collaboration, facilitated ideas, equal value of engagement regardless of your position in the organization, this emergent cellular model might seem to be a good fit, right? It's also very egalitarian. The board is actively looking for input from different members of the organization, different stakeholders. What could be the potential challenge here? Well, if nobody in the organization takes on that centralized leadership role, is there the possibility that decisions might stall out because we can't reach consensus and we don't want to offend anyone's sensibilities by coming in a more authoritative way to make a decision? But could that possibly lead to some inefficiencies down the line? So we can think about that again as maybe it's complementary, maybe there are some challenges. And then finally, the other example is the divisional and constituency representative. Again, divisional being based on those tasks where you have different members with skill sets who are all working towards one piece. The book example of the Metropolitan Opera might be an example of that, where you have the administrative division on one hand and the artistic division on the other. And then within those divisions, you're going to have people fulfilling different roles, from marketing to programs to finances. So as a constituency model that is delegated into subcommittees, that is particularly effective in large settings, would that emphasis on kind of decentralizing authority, even though it's formalized, be a complement to the divisional structure, which effectively works the same way? So again, just start thinking through these. Hopefully this gives you a little more insight as we're wrapping up the discussion for this unit over the next couple of days. And finally, our preparation for next week. We will be entering week 6. We're starting Unit 4, Nonprofit Leadership. I talked about that a little bit earlier in the lecture. But for next week, we're going to be reading chapters 11 and 12, which again focus on human resource management and, I've got this word, I promise, motivation. There it is. Thank you. And just as a heads up, I know we probably don't want to think about this since you just turned in another assignment this past weekend, but just as a heads up, that article analysis will be due Sunday, March 12th. You can find the full assignment description, grading rubric, and the 5 articles that I have selected on Canvas. They're already available for you. And as we're moving closer to that assignment date, if you have any questions, be sure to let me know. So thank you for sticking with me. Thank you for sticking through a longer lecture. I feel like my sign off is not as creative as Ellen DeGeneres, who always says, you know, be kind to people, have a great day. Mine tends to be thank you so much and see you, have a great weekend, see you next week. But that, I guess, is becoming a bit of my trademark sign off. So thank you, have a great weekend, and I will see you all next week. Take care.